Al-Ghazali is 37 years old. He is standing before his students at the Nizamiya Madrasa, the most prestigious institution of learning in the Islamic world. He has been teaching here for 4 years. Hundreds of students come to hear him lecture on theology, on law, on philosophy. He's famous, not just in Baghdad, across the entire Muslim world. He's considered one of the greatest minds of his generation. Politicians seek his advice. Scholars defer to his opinions. He has written dozens of books. He has wealth, influence, respect. He has everything a scholar could want. And he cannot speak. His tongue freezes. He tries to form words, and they will not come. He stands in front of his students, and nothing emerges. Not because he does not know what to say. He knows. He has prepared. He has given this lecture 100 times. But his body will not cooperate. His throat closes. His mouth goes dry. And after a few minutes of standing there, unable to produce a single sound, he walks out. And he does not come back. Physicians are called. They examine him. They diagnose a physical illness, something in the throat, something in the tongue, something that can be treated with medicine. But Ghazali knows better. He knows this is not a physical problem. This is a spiritual crisis. This is his soul refusing to continue. This is his body saying what his mind has been trying to ignore for months. You cannot keep doing this. You cannot keep teaching what you do not truly know. You cannot keep speaking about God when you do not know God. You know about God. You can describe God. You can prove God's existence through logical arguments. You can refute heretics and defend orthodox doctrine, but you do not know God. And that gap, that unbridgeable distance between knowing about something and knowing something directly, has become unbearable. For months before the collapse, Ghazali had been struggling. He would wake up in the middle of the night with a question that would not leave him alone. Is what I am teaching true? Not true in the sense of logically consistent, not true in the sense of conforming to scripture and tradition, but true in the sense of real, in the sense of lived, in the sense of transforming the person who knows it. He had spent his entire life accumulating knowledge. He had mastered theology. He had studied philosophy. He could argue any position. He could refute any challenge. But he had never asked himself the most basic question. Has this knowledge changed me? Has it made me closer to God? Has it made me a better person? Or have I just been collecting information, stacking up arguments, building a tower of words that points towards something I have never actually touched? And the answer, when he finally allowed himself to see it, was devastating. The knowledge had not changed him. It had made him proud. It had made him famous. It had given him power and prestige. But it had not brought him closer to God. It had brought him closer to his own ego. And every day, standing in front of his students, speaking with authority about things he had never experienced, he was participating in a lie. Not a deliberate lie, but a lie nonetheless. The lie that knowing about something is the same as knowing it. The lie that you can teach truth without living it. And his body, wiser than his mind, refused to continue. It shut down. It said no more. And Ghazali, for the first time in his life, had to face the question he had been avoiding. What do I actually know? And the answer was almost nothing. He knew facts. He knew arguments. He knew what the great scholars before him had said. He knew the Quran by heart. He knew the Hadith. He knew the intricate debates of theology and jurisprudence. But he did not know God. He knew about God the way someone who has read about swimming knows about water. Intellectually, abstractly, from a distance. But he had never been immersed. He had never tasted. He had never experienced the reality that all his knowledge was pointing toward. And this recognition broke him. Because if you have spent your entire life building an identity around being a scholar, around being someone who knows, and then you realize that you do not actually know anything that matters, what is left? Who are you when the thing you thought defined you is revealed to be empty? Ghazali spent months in this state, unable to teach, unable to work, barely able to eat or sleep. His students were confused, his colleagues were concerned. Political leaders tried to pressure him to return, but he could not, because he had come to the edge of something and he had a choice. He could go back to teaching, he could suppress the doubt, he could perform knowledge even though he did not possess it, or he could walk away from everything and go find what was real. And after months of suffering, months of internal torment, he made his decision. In November 1095, he left Baghdad. He told no one except his closest family. He gave away his wealth. He dressed as a poor, wandering Sufi, and he disappeared. He left behind fame, security, position. He left behind the life he had built, and he walked into the unknown. Not because he knew what he would find, but because he could no longer live with the knowledge that what he was teaching was not real, that his entire life had been a performance, that he had been speaking about God without knowing God, and that gap, once seen, could not be unseen. Before we follow Ghazali into the wilderness, we need to understand what he discovered, because the crisis he experienced is not unique to him. It is not unique to medieval Islam. It is the crisis of anyone who has ever confused information with transformation. Anyone who has ever mistaken intellectual understanding for lived experience. Anyone who has ever accumulated knowledge without being changed by it. Ghazali made a distinction that would become central to everything he wrote after his return. He said there are two kinds of knowledge. The first kind is knowledge of the intellect, in Arabic, ilm. This is knowledge that you acquire through study, through reading, through reasoning, through being taught. It is external knowledge. You can possess it without being transformed by it. You can know facts, you can know arguments, you can know what others have said about a subject. And this knowledge is necessary. It is not useless, but it is not sufficient. The second kind is knowledge of the heart, in Arabic, marifa. This is knowledge that you acquire through direct experience, through tasting, through being. It is internal knowledge, and it transforms you. You cannot possess it without being changed by it, because it is not about information, it is about encounter. It is about direct contact with reality. Ghazali gives an example. He says, there is a difference between knowing the definition of health and being healthy. You can study medicine, you can learn all the theories of what makes a body function properly, you can describe health in perfect medical terms, but if you are sick, all that knowledge will not make you healthy. Health is not information, health is a state, and you only know it by being it. Or consider drunkenness. You can read about alcohol, you can understand the chemical processes, you can know what happens to the brain when someone drinks, you can describe the symptoms of intoxication with perfect accuracy. But if you have never been drunk, you do not know what drunkenness is. You know about it, but you do not know it. And the person who has been drunk once knows more about drunkenness than the person who has read 1,000 books about it but never tasted wine. Or consider love. You can read poetry. You can study the psychology of attachment. You can understand the biological basis of attraction. You can describe love in eloquent terms. But if you have never loved, you do not know what love is. You know descriptions of love. You know theories about love, but you do not know love itself. And the person who is loved once, even if they cannot articulate it, knows more about love than the person who has memorized every poem ever written but never felt their heart break. And this, Ghazali realized, was the problem with his entire life up to that point. He had knowledge about God. He had studied theology for decades. He could prove God's existence. He could describe God's attributes. He could defend Islamic doctrine against any philosophical challenge. But he did not know God. He had never encountered God directly. He had never tasted the divine presence. He had never experienced what the Sufis called the unveiling, the moment when the veil between you and reality falls away and you see clearly for the first time. And this distinction changed everything, because if there are two kinds of knowledge, then there must be two paths, the path of the intellect and the path of the heart. And Ghazali had been walking the first path his entire life. He had been accumulating intellectual knowledge, thinking that if he learned enough, if he read enough, if he argued well enough, he would reach God. But God is not reached through arguments. God is reached through experience, and experience requires a different kind of practice. The philosophers, Ghazali realized, were trapped in the first kind of knowledge. They thought that reason alone could lead to truth, that if you constructed the right arguments, if you built the right logical system, you would arrive at certainty about the nature of reality. And Ghazali had been one of them. He had studied philosophy. He had read Aristotle, Avicenna, Al-Farabi. He had mastered their arguments, but he had also seen their limitations. Because reason can tell you that God exists. Reason can tell you that the universe has a cause, but reason cannot give you God. Reason cannot produce the direct encounter. Reason can point, but it cannot deliver. And the theologians were equally trapped. They spent their time defending doctrines. They argued about the attributes of God. They refuted heretics. They constructed elaborate systems to explain how God's justice and mercy can both be true. And all of this was necessary. Ghazali did not reject theology, but he saw that it was not enough. Because you can have perfect theological knowledge and still be far from God. You can defend every doctrine correctly and still have a heart that is closed. You can win every argument and still be lost. What Ghazali needed was the second kind of knowledge. And the people who had it were not the philosophers or the theologians. They were the Sufis, the mystics, the ones who did not just study God, but sought direct experience of God. The ones who did not just read about the divine, but practiced disciplines designed to open the heart so that the divine could be encountered directly. And this is where Ghazali's crisis led him, not to a new set of arguments, not to a better theological system, but to a recognition that he needed a different kind of knowing. And that kind of knowing could not be found in books. It could only be found in practice, in solitude, in purification, in the slow, difficult work of removing the barriers that prevent the heart from seeing clearly. Ghazali tells a story about a Sufi he met before his crisis. The Sufi was illiterate. He could not read. He could not engage in philosophical arguments. He did not know theology in any formal sense. But when Ghazali spoke to him, he felt something, a presence, a depth, a certainty that was not based on arguments, but on something else. And the Sufi said to him, "You know many things, but do you know God?" And Ghazali at the time was offended. He was the great scholar. Of course he knew God. But years later, after the crisis, he remembered that conversation, and he understood. The illiterate Sufi had what Ghazali lacked, direct experience, the second kind of knowledge, the knowledge of the heart. And this is what Ghazali went to find. Not more information, but transformation. Not more arguments about God, but encounter with God. And the only way to get there, he realized, was to leave behind everything that had defined him and start over. Ghazali came to understand something that most people never see. The problem is not that we lack knowledge. The problem is that our hearts are diseased. And diseased hearts cannot perceive truth. They cannot encounter God. They cannot see clearly, because the diseases cloud everything. They distort perception. They create barriers between you and reality. And no amount of intellectual knowledge can cure them, because the cure is not more information. The cure is purification. Ghazali used a metaphor. He said the heart is like a mirror. When the mirror is polished, it reflects light clearly. It shows you reality as it is. But when the mirror is tarnished, covered in rust, covered in dust, it reflects nothing, or it reflects only distortions. And most people's hearts, Ghazali said, are covered, not because they are bad people, not because they are deliberately sinful, but because they have accumulated layers of attachment, layers of ego, layers of desire that prevent them from seeing clearly. And he identified 4 primary diseases of the heart, 4 conditions that block direct knowledge of God, 4 things that keep you trapped in the first kind of knowledge, unable to access the second. The first disease is love of the world, in Arabic, hub al-dunya. This is not about enjoying material things. This is about attachment, about believing that security, happiness, and fulfillment can be found in things that are temporary, about organizing your life around accumulating possessions, status, comfort, about thinking that if you just get enough, if you just achieve enough, you will finally be satisfied. And Ghazali knew this disease intimately, because he had everything the world could offer, fame, wealth, prestige, and none of it satisfied. None of it filled the emptiness, because the emptiness is not caused by a lack of external things. The emptiness is caused by the absence of connection to what is real, and no amount of worldly success can substitute for that. The second disease is love of leadership, in Arabic, hub al-riyasa. This is the addiction to being seen, recognized, important. The need to be the expert, the authority, the one everyone looks to. And Ghazali saw this in himself. He realized that he was not teaching for the sake of truth. He was teaching for the sake of applause. He was not sharing knowledge to help others. He was sharing knowledge to maintain his position, to feed his ego, to feel important. And every time he lectured, every time students looked at him with admiration, he was feeding this disease. He was reinforcing the false self that needed to be important. And as long as that need existed, he could not be honest. He could not see clearly, because everything he said was contaminated by the desire to be seen as wise rather than the desire to be wise. The third disease is ostentation, in Arabic, riya. This is performing piety, looking spiritual while being empty inside, praying in public to be seen as devout, fasting so others will think you are disciplined, speaking about God to appear knowledgeable. And Ghazali caught himself doing this constantly. He saw the gap between his external performance and his internal state. He was teaching about humility while being proud. He was lecturing about the dangers of ego while feeding his own. He was speaking about the love of God while loving himself. And this hypocrisy, once he saw it, became unbearable, because it meant that everything he was doing was a lie. Not a deliberate lie, but a lie nonetheless, the lie of appearance without substance. The fourth disease is pride, in Arabic, kibr. This is intellectual arrogance, the belief that you are better because of your knowledge, the scholar who looks down on those who have not studied, the religious person who feels superior to those who are not as devout. And Ghazali realized he had this disease too. He saw that his knowledge had not made him humble, it had made him arrogant.
He had started to believe that because he knew more than others, he was closer to God than others. But this was exactly backward, because true knowledge makes you humble. True knowledge makes you realize how little you know. True knowledge makes you aware of your own limitations, your own blindness, your own need for grace.
And these 4 diseases, Ghazali realized, were not unique to him. They are universal. Everyone has them to some degree, and they prevent you from seeing clearly. They keep you trapped in ego. They keep you performing rather than being. They keep you accumulating information rather than being transformed. And the problem is that you cannot think your way out of them. You cannot study your way out of them. You cannot argue them away, because they are not intellectual problems. They are diseases of the heart. And the heart is cured not through study, but through practice. The cure, Ghazali discovered, is purification. In Arabic, tazkiyah. This is not about becoming perfect. This is about removing what blocks the heart, like polishing a mirror. You do not add light to a mirror, you remove the dust. And when the dust is removed, the mirror reflects naturally. It does what it was designed to do. And the heart is the same. When the diseases are removed, when the attachments are loosened, when the ego is no longer controlling everything, the heart sees, it perceives, it knows, not through arguments, but through direct perception. And the practices that purify the heart are simple but difficult. Solitude, so you are not constantly performing for others. Silence, so you are not filling the space with noise. Remembrance of God, repeating the divine names until the words dissolve and only presence remains.
Fasting, not as ritual, but as discipline, as a way of confronting desire and learning that you are not controlled by it. Service to others, not as charity, but as ego death, as a way of getting out of your own head and being present to someone else's need. And daily examination, looking honestly at your state, asking where the diseases are active, where you are performing rather than being, where you are trapped in ego rather than open to what is real. Ghazali spent 11 years doing this work, 11 years of wandering, 11 years of solitude, 11 years of removing the layers that had accumulated over a lifetime. And what he discovered was not new doctrines, not new arguments, but a different way of being, a way of being present, a way of being honest, a way of being open. And from that way of being, knowledge emerged. Not intellectual knowledge, but the second kind, the knowledge of the heart, the knowledge that transforms. While Ghazali was in Baghdad before the crisis, he wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. It was a systematic demolition of Aristotelian philosophy as it had been developed by Muslim thinkers like Avicenna and Al-Farabi. And this book is important not because Ghazali rejected reason, he did not. He used reason extensively throughout his life, but he saw its limits. He saw where reason, when treated as the only path to truth, leads you astray. The philosophers had made 3 claims that Ghazali considered not just wrong, but dangerous. The first claim was that the universe is eternal, that it has always existed, that there was no moment of creation, that matter and form have always been in existence. And this claim, Ghazali argued, is incompatible with revelation. The Quran says God created the universe. It says there was a beginning. And if you deny this, you are not just disagreeing with a doctrine, you are undermining the entire framework of meaning that revelation provides. The second claim was that God knows universals, but not particulars. That God knows the forms, the patterns, the laws, but does not know individual things. God knows the concept of humanity, but does not know you specifically. God knows the laws of nature, but does not know what you did yesterday. And this, Ghazali said, is devastating. Because if God does not know you individually, then you do not matter. Then the universe is cold, impersonal, indifferent. Then prayer is meaningless.
then the idea of a relationship with God is an illusion. And this claim, like the first, is incompatible with revelation, which says that God knows everything, including the number of hairs on your head, including your thoughts before you think them.
The third claim was that there is no bodily resurrection, that when you die, your body is gone forever, that only the soul, if it exists, continues, that the idea of physical resurrection is a metaphor, not a literal truth. And again, Ghazali said this is incompatible with revelation. The Quran explicitly describes bodily resurrection, and if you deny it, you are saying that the central promise of the faith is false. But Ghazali's critique was not just theological, it was also epistemological. He was asking, how do you know these things? How do the philosophers know that the universe is eternal? They cannot prove it. They infer it from certain metaphysical assumptions, but the assumptions themselves are not proven. They are just assumed. And if the foundation is assumption, then the entire edifice is uncertain. The philosophers claim to offer certainty through reason, but they do not. They offer speculation dressed up as certainty. And Ghazali wanted people to see this, to see that philosophy, for all its sophistication, does not deliver what it promises. But he was not saying that philosophy is useless. He was saying that philosophy is a tool, not the destination. Reason is necessary. You need logic. You need the ability to think clearly, to analyze arguments, to distinguish sound reasoning from fallacious reasoning.
But reason alone cannot give you God. Reason can point toward God. Reason can show you that the universe requires a cause. Reason can demonstrate that there must be something necessary, something that does not depend on anything else. But reason stops there. Reason can get you to the threshold, but it cannot take you through the door. For that, you need something else. You need the second kind of knowledge. You need direct experience. And this is why Ghazali's critique of philosophy is also a critique of himself. Because he had been trying to reach God through reason. He had been trying to achieve certainty through arguments, and it did not work. It could not work. Because the object of the search is not an idea. The object of the search is a presence, and presence cannot be grasped by concepts. Presence can only be encountered, and encounter requires a different faculty, not the intellect, the heart. Ghazali tells a story about a man who wants to know what honey tastes like, and he goes to scholars and asks them to describe honey, and they do. They tell him honey is sweet. They describe its texture, its color, its origin. They give him a complete intellectual account of honey, and the man thanks them and goes away.
But he still does not know what honey tastes like, because knowing about honey is not the same as tasting honey, and no amount of description will substitute for the taste. You have to put the honey on your tongue. You have to experience it directly, and then you know, not through words, but through taste. And God, Ghazali says, is like honey. You can read all the theology in the world. You can master all the philosophical arguments. You can describe God's attributes with perfect accuracy. But until you taste, until you experience the divine presence directly, you do not know. You know about, but you do not know. And the work of Sufism, the work of the mystics, is to help you taste. Not to give you more information, but to create the conditions in which direct experience becomes possible. And those conditions are not intellectual, they are practical. They require discipline, practice, purification. They require you to do something, not just think something. So Ghazali did not reject philosophy, he integrated it. He said, use reason to clear away confusion, use logic to refute bad arguments, use philosophy to prepare the ground. But do not stop there. Do not mistake the preparation for the goal. The goal is not knowledge about God. The goal is knowledge of God. And that requires you to walk a different path, a path that the philosophers, in their commitment to reason alone, refuse to walk.
In November 1095, Ghazali left Baghdad. He told people he was going on pilgrimage, but he did not go straight to Mecca. He went to Damascus. And he stayed there for months, living in seclusion, praying in the corners of mosques, fasting, practicing the disciplines he had read about but never truly practiced. He was not teaching, he was not writing, he was not debating. He was just being. And this, for someone whose entire identity had been built around intellectual activity, was terrifying. Because when you stop performing, when you stop doing the things that make you feel important, you have to face yourself. And what Ghazali found when he faced himself was not pleasant. He found pride. He found attachment. He found the gap between who he appeared to be and who he actually was. And the work was to close that gap, not by improving the appearance, but by transforming the reality. From Damascus, he went to Jerusalem. He spent months there, praying at the Dome of the Rock, visiting the holy sites, sitting in solitude. He was stripping away the scholar identity, removing the layers of ego that had accumulated over decades, learning what it meant to be no one, to be just another seeker among many, not the famous Ghazali, not the great scholar, just a man trying to know God.
From Jerusalem, he went to Hebron, to the tomb of Abraham, then to Mecca and Medina for the pilgrimage, and then he returned to his hometown of Tus in Persia, and he stayed there for years, living simply, teaching occasionally, but not in the old way, not as the authority, but as someone sharing what he was learning, writing, but not academic treatises, writing about the inner life, about the diseases of the heart, about the practices that purify, about what he was discovering through experience rather than through books. During these years, Ghazali was doing the work he had never done. He was praying not as ritual, but as conversation. He was fasting not as obligation, but as discipline. He was practicing vikr, the remembrance of God, repeating the divine names until the words dissolved and only presence remained. He was serving the poor, not as charity, but as a way of getting out of his own head. He was watching his thoughts, his desires, his reactions, learning where the ego was active, where the diseases were operating, where he was still performing rather than being. And slowly, over years, something shifted, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually. The heart began to open. The mirror began to reflect. The barriers began to fall away. And what emerged was not new knowledge in the intellectual sense. What emerged was clarity, presence, a sense of connection that had been missing his entire life. He began to experience what he had only read about. He began to taste what he had only described. He began to know God, not just know about God. And he tells a story about a dream he had during these years. He was standing in front of a vast crowd, teaching as he had in Baghdad, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. He looked down at his books and the pages were blank. He tried to speak and his voice was gone. And he woke up understanding, everything I built in Baghdad was noise. The real work is silence. The real teaching is presence. The real knowledge is what cannot be spoken. After 11 years, Ghazali was asked to return to teaching. There was political pressure. The Muslim world was in turmoil, and people wanted his guidance. And reluctantly, he agreed. But he was not the same teacher. He did not teach from books the way he used to. He taught from experience. He did not just explain doctrines, he shared practices. He did not just refute errors, he described the path. And his teaching, after the crisis, had a different quality. It had weight. It had authority that did not come from position but from something else, from having walked the path, from having done the work, from speaking not about what he had read, but about what he had lived. And he wrote. He wrote The Revival of the Religious Sciences, a massive work in 40 books covering every aspect of Islamic practice. But it was not like his earlier works. It was not just theology and law. It was psychology. It was spirituality. It was a manual for the inner life. It described the diseases of the heart and their cures. It explained why ritual matters, not just as obligation, but as practice, as discipline, as training for the heart. It integrated everything he had learned from the philosophers, the theologians, and the Sufis, and it became one of the most influential books in Islamic history. Not because it offered new doctrines, but because it offered a path, a way of transforming knowledge into wisdom, a way of turning information into lived reality. Ghazali never regretted leaving Baghdad. He said that the worst decision he could have made would have been to stay, to keep teaching what he did not know, to keep performing knowledge while lacking experience. The crisis, painful as it was, saved him. It forced him to face what he had been avoiding. It forced him to walk the path he had been teaching about. It forced him to close the gap between what he knew intellectually and what he knew in his heart. And that closing, that integration, is what made him not just a scholar, but a sage.
You are not Ghazali. You are not living in 11th century Baghdad. You are not a famous scholar facing a spiritual crisis. But the question he faced is your question. The gap he discovered is your gap. The disease he diagnosed is your disease. Because the gap between knowing about something and knowing it, between information and transformation, between performing and being, is universal. It is not limited to medieval Islam. It is not limited to religious people. It is the condition of anyone who has ever confused learning with living. You know things. You have read books. You have studied. You have ideas about how life should be lived. You know about meditation, but do you meditate? You know about kindness, but are you kind? You know about presence, but are you present? You know about letting go, but have you let go? And the gap between what you know and what you do is where the disease lives. That gap is where the ego operates. That gap is where you are performing rather than being. That gap is where you are trapped. And Ghazali is asking you, what are you going to do about that gap? Are you going to keep accumulating information? Are you going to keep reading books, attending lectures, collecting insights, thinking that if you just learn enough, you will somehow be transformed? Or are you going to recognize that transformation does not come from more information? Transformation comes from practice, from doing, from closing the gap between what you know and how you live. The first step, Ghazali says, is to see the disease, to recognize that the problem is not lack of knowledge. The problem is the state of your heart, the attachments, the ego, the performance, the gap between who you appear to be and who you actually are. And seeing this is painful, because it means admitting that you have been lying to yourself, that you have been performing spirituality, performing wisdom, performing presence, while actually being trapped in ego, in need, in the same old patterns. The second step is to commit to purification, not to becoming perfect, but to removing what blocks the heart. And the practices are simple, not easy, but simple. Solitude, so you stop performing for others. Silence, so you stop filling the space with noise. Service, so you stop being trapped in your own head. Watching yourself, so you see where the ego is active, where the diseases are operating, where you are still pretending, and doing this daily, not as a project with an endpoint, but as a practice, as a way of life. The third step is to be patient, because the diseases of the heart are not cured quickly. Ghazali spent 11 years doing this work, 11 years of stripping away what was false, 11 years of learning to be rather than to perform. And even then, he said the work was not finished. It is never finished, because as long as you are alive, the ego is active. As long as you are alive, the diseases are there. But they can be weakened, they can be seen, they can be worked with. And slowly, over time, the heart opens, the mirror polishes,
the presence emerges. Ghazali tells a story about a man who came to a Sufi master and said, "I have studied everything. I have read all the books. I know all the doctrines. Now teach me Sufism." And the master said, "Go to the marketplace and let people insult you. Come back when you feel nothing." And the man was offended. He said, "I am educated. I am learned. This is beneath me." And the master said, "Then you have learned nothing. Your knowledge has made you proud. Now go learn to be humble. Because until you can be insulted without reacting, until your ego is not running the show, all your knowledge is just noise." And this is what Ghazali learned, that the goal is not more knowledge, the goal is transformation. The goal is to close the gap between what you know and who you are. The goal is to become what you know, not to know more, but to be what you know. And that requires something different from study. It requires practice. It requires discipline. It requires you to do the work that most people avoid because it is uncomfortable, because it requires you to face yourself, because it means admitting that you do not actually know what you thought you knew. Ghazali's final teaching, the teaching he gave days before he died, is called the Dokodu in some traditions, but in Islamic sources it is his counsel to students. He said, "Knowledge without action is madness.
Action without knowledge is void. But know that after death, what you have practiced will accompany you. What you merely knew will be left behind. The information will not follow you. The degrees will not follow you. The books you read will not follow you. What will follow you is what you became, who you were, how you treated people, how present you were, how kind you were, how honest you were. And that is determined not by what you know, but by what you practice. So the question is not, how much do you know? The question is, what are you practicing? What are you actually doing? What is the gap between what you know you should do and what you are doing? And are you willing to close that gap? Are you willing to do the work that transformation requires? Or are you going to keep collecting information, thinking that someday, when you have learned enough, you will magically become the person you want to be? Ghazali walked away from everything to close that gap. And he is not asking you to do the same. He is not asking you to leave your life, give away your possessions, wander for 11 years. But he is asking you to recognize the gap.
To see where you are performing rather than being. To see where your knowledge has made you proud rather than humble. To see where you are speaking about things you have not lived. And to commit today to closing that gap. Not perfectly, not completely, but to start. To take one thing you know you should do and do it. To take one practice you know would help and practice it. To take one gap between knowing and being and begin to close it. Because the transformation you are seeking is not in the next book. It is not in the next lecture. It is not in the next insight. It is in the practice, in the doing, in the daily work of becoming what you know. And that work is available to you now, not someday, now. And the question is, will you do it, or will you keep reading about it? Knowledge that does not transform you is a burden, not a blessing. Walk the path. Don't just study it.